Sometimes fortune disguises itself as misfortune, and only the desperate can see beyond appearances. Thomas Mitchell arrived in the town of Cedar Ridge one August afternoon, when the heat made the dust dance over the main street like thirsty ghosts. He carried only a worn-out leather suitcase and 25 cents in his pocket, all that was left after creditors took his hardware store in Kansas City. The man was 42 years old and had the tired expression of someone who had learned that life does not always reward honest work. The farm had been for sale for 3 years, according to the local merchant. No one wanted that cursed land, he said, shaking his head as he pointed to the lands beyond the hill. The place had a name, Fazenda Esperanza Perdida, and the nickname was not just poetry. 5 families tried to make their home there. They all left before the first winter, leaving behind only whispered stories about unproductive soil and dry wells. Thomas walked to the property in the late afternoon, noting the remains of the broken fence and the main house that leaned to one side like a drunken man. The planks creaked in the wind, creating a melancholy melody that seemed to tell the story of all the dreams that died there. The barn was in better shape, but its doors remained open, revealing only empty shadows and rotting hay. The sun was setting as he met the real estate agent in the town hall. The fat man almost choked on the drink when Thomas pulled the coins from his pocket. 25 cents? For that land? That's all I have, Thomas replied simply. The agent studied the determined face in front of him. There was something in the eyes of that stranger. Not despair, but a dangerous stillness of one who had lost everything and was not afraid of losing again. 3 years of trying to get rid of that property had taught the agent that sometimes it is better to accept any offer than to continue paying taxes on dead land. "May God protect you," he murmured as he prepared the papers. The next morning, Thomas woke up on the floor of the house that was now his. He had slept wrapped in his coat, using the suitcase as a pillow. The dawn light filtered through the loose planks of the windows, creating golden patterns on the peeling walls. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind that whistled through the cracks. He spent the first few days exploring every corner of the property. The main house needed extensive repairs, but the structure was solid. The barn could house animals again with some work. There was a well next to the house, covered with rotten planks that he carefully removed. It was then that he found the first clue. At the bottom of the well, where there should have been water, Thomas saw something that shone in the sunlight. It was not a reflection of the water. The well had been completely dry for years. He descended a makeshift rope and discovered a rock formation unlike anything he knew. The stones had a blue-gray hue and appeared to contain small crystals that captured and reflected light. He climbed up from the well with a piece of the strange rock in his hand. The material was heavier than he expected and had a unique texture, rough as sandstone, but with veins that resembled metal. He had never seen anything like it on his travels through the Midwest, but he had read about similar mineral formations in the mining newspapers that reached the larger cities. That night, as Thomas examined the sample by lamplight, he began to understand why 5 families had left the land. They came looking for fertile soil and abundant water. They found dry wells and apparently barren earth. They left carrying disappointment and stories of bad luck, but none of them went down to the bottom of the wells to investigate why there was no water. Thomas smiled for the first time in months. Perhaps fortune really did disguise itself as disgrace, and perhaps he was desperate enough to acknowledge it. Thomas woke up before dawn with the determination of a man who had finally found purpose. The strange rock rested on the makeshift table next to his bed, catching the first rays of the sun that seeped through the cracks in the windows. He had spent half the night examining that piece of mineral, trying to remember everything he knew about mining and geological formations. Over the next few days, Thomas methodically explored each abandoned well on the property. There were 5 in all, scattered around the farm like ancient scars in the barren landscape. All had been dry for years, and in each of them he found the same blue-grey rock formation. The previous families had given up when they saw the absence of water, but Thomas began to suspect that those wells had never been dug deep enough to reach the water table. The mineral was blocking the passage of water. With improvised tools and a determination that surprised even himself, Thomas set to work in the well closest to the house. Breaking that rock was hard work. The material was tougher than ordinary stone, and each blow of the pickaxe sent sparks through his weary arms. But gradually, layer by layer, he managed to penetrate the mineral formation. It was on the third day of excavation that the water began to sprout. First just a wire, then a steady stream that quickly turned into a bountiful well. The water was crystal clear and fresh, better than anything Thomas had tasted in his travels west. But it wasn't just the water that thrilled him. The chunks of rock he had removed revealed increasingly rich veins of the unknown mineral. Thomas carried a larger sample into town, keeping it hidden in his suitcase. At the real estate agent's office, he feigned casual interest by asking about the geological history of the region. The fat man shook his head contemptuously, repeating the stories everyone knew about that cursed land. At the local ironwork, Thomas watched discreetly as the owner examined pieces of iron and other metals. There was something familiar about the color and weight of the material he found, but it needed confirmation. He recalled reading about similar discoveries in the mountains of Colorado, where miners had found rich veins of silver in formations that initially seemed unproductive. For the next week, Thomas worked quietly, digging and extracting the mineral from 2 additional wells. Each excavation revealed more water and more rich veins of that peculiar material. The farm that everyone considered cursed was slowly turning into something completely different. The mornings began to have a comforting routine. Thomas awoke to the singing of the first birds that had returned to the property, attracted by the fresh water from the newly opened wells. He prepared a simple coffee on the improvised stove and walked through the land that now showed signs of life. Small green shoots began to appear near the water sources, and for the first time in years, the Lost Hope Farm justified part of its original name. But Thomas knew that his secret could not remain hidden forever. The transformation of the property was becoming visible even from a distance. Travelers passing by the main road began to comment on the smoke rising from the chimney of the previously abandoned house. Some stopped to investigate, being surprised to find a hard-working man where once there was only ruins. The local merchant was the first to ask direct questions. He visited the farm on a hot September afternoon, ostensibly to check if Thomas needed supplies, but clearly curious about the changes that everyone in town had noticed. He walked around the property with attentive eyes, observing the functional wells and the earth that was beginning to green. Thomas received him with careful courtesy, offering fresh water and talking about the time and prospects of the harvest. He didn't mention the mineral, but he noticed the visitor's growing interest when he noticed pieces of blue-grey rock piled up near the barn. That night, alone again, Thomas made a decision that would change not only his fate, but that of the entire region. It was time to find out exactly what he had found, and that meant a trip to the larger city where an expert could confirm his suspicions. The fortune had revealed itself, but it still needed to be claimed. The trip to Silver Creek took 2 days on horseback, traversing landscapes that gradually shifted from the familiar arid to greener valleys. Thomas carried his most promising samples in a tightly tied leather bag, protecting those pieces of rock as if they were rough diamonds. The larger city was buzzing with activity. Merchants, miners, entire families looking for opportunities in the expanding West. The mining expert's office was on a side street, discreet between a saddlery and a grain warehouse. James Patterson was a small, meticulous man with glasses that magnified his prying eyes and hands stained by decades of handling mineral samples. He had arrived from the East 5 years earlier, bringing knowledge of the most modern techniques for identifying and valuing deposits. Thomas watched in silence as Patterson examined each sample with instruments that seemed to belong more in a laboratory than in an office in the Midwest. The expert scratched, heated, weighed and tested each piece with the precision of a watchmaker. His eyebrows raised slightly when he analyzed the richer veins, but his face remained professionally neutral. The confirmation was accompanied by numbers that made Thomas lean on the chair. It wasn't just silver, it was high-quality silver, mixed with small amounts of other precious metals that significantly increased the total value. Patterson estimated that based on the samples presented, that formation could contain enough reserves to sustain mining operations for decades. The way back to Cedar Ridge was a completely different journey. Thomas rode with the poise of a man who had just discovered that he was far richer than he had ever dared to dream. But along with the euphoria came a more sober understanding of the situation. His small 25-cent farm was about to become the center of a transformation that would change the entire region. During the journey, he formulated a plan. First, it needed to legally protect its rights to property and mineral deposits. Then, he would have to decide whether to develop the mine alone or seek partners with capital and experience. But above all, he needed to keep it secret until all the preparations were complete. Upon arriving home, Thomas found his property slightly different. There were horse footprints near the barn, and some of the pieces of rock he had left piled up had been disturbed. Someone had been there during his absence, investigating with more than just casual curiosity. The transformation of the farm was not going unnoticed, and people were beginning to ask more direct questions. Over the next few days, Thomas quietly stepped up his exploration work. He dug small test holes at different points on the property, mentally mapping the extent of the mineral deposit. What he found exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The formation extended over almost the entire area of the farm, varying in richness, but maintaining consistent quality. The water kept pouring out abundantly from the cleaned wells, transforming the surrounding landscape. Thomas planted a small garden near the house, more to keep up the appearances of an ordinary farmer than out of real need for food. But there was genuine satisfaction in seeing life spring up in that land that everyone had considered dead. It was on an October afternoon that he received his first official visit. A well-dressed man arrived in a polished carriage, introducing himself as a representative of a Denver-based mining company. He had heard rumors about interesting discoveries in the region and had come to investigate it himself. His eyes were sharp as a vulture's, and Thomas immediately realized that he was dealing with someone who understood very well the value of what he had found. The visitor walked through the property with barely concealed interest, asking seemingly casual questions about the history of the farm and recent improvements. Thomas responded with the caution of someone who has learned that information is power, especially when that information is worth a fortune. He didn't lie, but he didn't reveal more than necessary either. During the conversation, it became clear that rumors about the transformation of Lost Hope Farm had reached much wider circles than the small town of Cedar Ridge. The company's representative casually mentioned other mineral deposits in the region, trying to assess whether Thomas was aware of the true nature of his discovery. That night, alone again, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had bought that land with the last pennies he owned, looking only for a place to start over. Now he found himself the guardian of a discovery that could transform not only his life, but the entire regional economy. Entire cities had sprung up around discoveries smaller than his. Watching the stars through the repaired window of his home, Thomas realized that the next few months would determine whether he could maintain control over his discovery or whether he would be swallowed up by the larger forces that would inevitably take an interest in his small 25-cent farm. The night wind carried promises of change, and for the first time since his arrival, Thomas felt truly alone with the weight of his secret. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it more than just the biting cold of the distant mountains. Thomas awoke on a freezing November morning to find that his property was fenced off, not by armed men or law enforcement, but by something far more subtle and dangerous: organized business interest. 3 elegant carriages were parked on the main road, and men in suits watched their farm through binoculars. A makeshift camp had sprung up on the neighboring property, where alleged surveyors carried out measurements that clearly extended beyond the legal limits of their activities. Word of Lost Hope Farm had leaked out, and now Thomas faced the kind of pressure that turned honest men into fugitives or forced them to accept disadvantageous deals. Over the next few weeks, the offers arrived like an avalanche. First came the local middlemen, offering sums that seemed enormous to a man who had bought the property for 25 cents, but which Thomas knew represented only a fraction of the real value. Then came representatives of larger companies with more sophisticated proposals that included production percentages and long-term contracts. Each visitor studied Thomas with the attention of a professional player evaluating an opponent. They expected to find a simple farmer, easily intimidated or seduced by sums that would seem like fortunes to someone in his position. Instead, they came across a man who had lost everything once and had learned to recognize the true value of things. Thomas developed a careful routine. He received all visitors with courtesy, listened to their proposals with apparent attention, but did not commit himself to anything. Meanwhile, he quietly strengthened his legal position. He hired a lawyer in Silver Creek, properly recorded all of his mineral rights, and meticulously documented every aspect of his discovery. The pressure increased when the first rumors came that other companies were investigating adjacent properties, looking for extensions of the same mineral deposit. Thomas understood that his window of opportunity to trade from a position of strength was closing fast. Soon there would be competition, and with it, the possibility that your small farm would become just one piece in a much bigger game. It was then that he made the decision that would define not only his future, but the legacy of that entire region. Instead of selling to a single large company, Thomas opted for a different strategy. He formed a partnership with 3 smaller investors, men he had met during his trips to Silver Creek, all with mining experience but not enough capital to compete with the big corporations. Together, they created the Cedar Ridge Mining Company, with Thomas retaining the majority stake and operational control. The decision was not popular with representatives of the big companies. Offers have increased dramatically, some accompanied by veiled threats about the difficulties that small operators faced in an industry dominated by powerful interests. But Thomas had learned something important during his years in the trade. Sometimes the best defense against predators is to become strong enough not to be easy prey. The first official excavation began the following spring. Thomas hired experienced miners from other regions, offering fair wages and profit sharing, an unusual practice that ensured genuine loyalty from his workforce. The operation grew methodically, avoiding the errors of over-ambition that plagued many similar ventures. The results beat even Patterson's optimistic estimates. The deposit was even richer and more extensive than the initial samples had suggested. But more important than mineral wealth was the way Thomas chose to develop it. Instead of exploring quickly and leaving, he invested in local infrastructure, building not just a mine, but a sustainable operation that benefited the entire community. Cedar Ridge gradually transformed from a sleepy town into a thriving center of commerce and industry. New houses have sprung up to house the families of the miners. Merchants arrived to meet the growing needs of the population. A school was built, then a church, and finally even a small hospital. Thomas never moved out of the original house he had repaired with his own hands. Even as his wealth grew beyond anything he could have imagined, he maintained the simple habits of a man who knew the value of essentials. He would get up before dawn, walk around his property personally checking every aspect of the operation, and keep the door open for any worker who needed to talk to him. Years later, when big city journalists came to document the unlikely success of the Cedar Ridge Mining Company, They invariably asked about Thomas's secret. How had a man who had bought an abandoned farm for 25 cents managed to create one of the most successful mining ventures in the West? Thomas always gave the same answer, simple and direct. He had learned that sometimes what others see as a curse can be a blessing to those who have the courage to look deeper. The 5 families who left that land were looking for water on the surface. He had the patience to dig until he found it, and in the process discovered something much more valuable. The Lost Hope Farm had finally vindicated its original name, not because it had regained lost hope, but because it had revealed that it had never really disappeared. It was just buried deeper than most people were willing to dig. And on a golden autumn afternoon, 10 years after his arrival, Thomas Mitchell sat on the porch of the house that had become the symbol of one of the most extraordinary transformations of the American West. I watched the workers return from the mine, greeting them by name, knowing that I had created something lasting in a land that everyone considered dead. Sometimes fortune really does disguise itself as disgrace, and the 25 cents best invested in the Cedar Ridge story were living proof of that truth. Thomas Mitchell's story teaches us that sometimes the greatest opportunities lurk where no one else wants to look. How many times have you gone through something that seemed worthless but could have changed your life completely? The Lost Hope Farm was seen as a curse by everyone in the region. 5 families gave up on that land, convinced that nothing good could grow there, but Thomas had the courage to dig deeper, to investigate beyond the surface. He discovered that what everyone saw as a problem was actually the solution to his dreams. Life is full of opportunities disguised as obstacles. People who see beyond appearances are the ones who truly thrive. Thomas wasn't smarter than the others. He just had a different perspective. While others saw dry wells, he saw hidden potential. While others saw cursed land, he saw untapped possibilities. The difference between success and failure is often in the willingness to try when others give up. How many inspiring stories like this have you missed because you didn't know them? How many valuable lessons about perseverance and strategic vision have failed to reach you? This channel is dedicated to sharing these powerful narratives of the American Wild West. Real stories of men and women who turned adversity into opportunity. Tales that teach about courage, determination, and the importance of never giving up on your dreams. Each story is a life lesson disguised as entertainment. If you want to continue discovering these transformative narratives, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these inspiring stories that can change your perspective on life's challenges.